The valley was silent in a way that only existed before bloodshed, the kind of silence that presses against the ears and forces a man to listen to his own breathing. In the year 1645, as the sky slowly shifted from black to a dull shade of ash, a young samurai named Jubit stood barefoot on cold earth outside the dojo, his fingers tightening around the hilt of a sword he had trained with since childhood. Tomorrow, that sword would no longer be a symbol of discipline or tradition, it would become an instrument of survival. Jubit had imagined this moment for years, believing that courage would arrive naturally when the time came, but now that the moment was near, fear had filled every empty space inside him. His chest felt heavy, his thoughts scattered, his body betraying him with trembling hands and shallow breaths. He had fought wooden dummies, sparred with fellow students, memorized forms until his muscles moved without thought, yet none of that quieted the voice in his mind whispering that tomorrow he could fail, tomorrow he could die. As dawn approached, he sought out his master, an old warrior whose face carried the weight of countless battles and whose eyes reflected a calm that felt almost unnatural. Jubit bowed deeply, struggling to keep his voice steady as he confessed what he believed was weakness, admitting that fear had taken hold of him so completely that he doubted his ability to stand when steel met steel. He expected disappointment, perhaps anger, or at least a lecture about honor and bravery, but the master's response was unsettling in its simplicity. He did not deny fear's presence, nor did he attempt to erase it with comforting words. Instead, he acknowledged it as an inevitable companion, explaining that fear was not a flaw in Jubit's character but a natural response to uncertainty and danger. The master spoke slowly, deliberately, telling him that every warrior who had ever survived battle had felt exactly what he was feeling now, and that those who claimed otherwise were either lying or already dead. Courage, he explained, was never about feeling ready or confident, it was about acting despite the chaos within. Fear would not disappear when the first strike was made, nor would it vanish with experience, but through discipline and repetition, it could be stripped of its authority. Jubit listened, confused yet captivated, as the master described fear not as an enemy to be destroyed but as a force to be understood and ignored through action. The battlefield, he said, did not reward those who waited for calm, because calm rarely arrived. It rewarded those who had trained their bodies and minds to move forward even when every instinct screamed to retreat. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground, Jubit realized that the lesson before him was far greater than swordsmanship. It was about mastery of the self, about learning that fear would accompany him not only into battle but throughout life, appearing whenever something meaningful was at stake. In that moment, standing between night and day, Jubit understood that the path of the warrior was not one of fearlessness, but one of discipline so strong that fear could exist without controlling the outcome. The following weeks unfolded like a slow-burning test of endurance, one designed not to strengthen the body but to exhaust the mind. Jubit expected harder drills, faster strikes, and longer sparring sessions, yet the master imposed something far more unsettling: stillness. At dawn, while the rest of the dojo echoed with the sound of wooden swords colliding, Jubit was ordered to sit alone beneath a withered pine at the edge of the grounds, his sword laid across his knees, forbidden from moving for hours at a time. The instructions were vague, almost cruel in their simplicity: observe, breathe, and do nothing. At first, Jubit's thoughts rebelled violently against the silence. Memories of past failures, imagined futures, and the looming threat of battle crowded his mind like shouting voices. His legs ached, insects crawled across his skin, and his breathing grew uneven as impatience turned into quiet anger. He wondered if this was punishment for his confession of fear, or perhaps a test meant to humiliate him. But each time frustration rose, the master appeared briefly, saying nothing, only adjusting Jubit's posture or tapping his chest to remind him to breathe lower and slower. Over time, something subtle began to shift. Jubit noticed that thoughts came and went like clouds rather than commands demanding obedience. Fear still surfaced, but it no longer overwhelmed him in the same way. Instead, it passed through, leaving behind a strange clarity. The master later explained that most warriors lost battles long before the first strike because their minds were already exhausted by imagined outcomes. This discipline, though rarely spoken of and almost never taught openly, was meant to sharpen awareness under pressure by removing the habit of reacting to every internal disturbance. Jubit learned that the body followed the mind's lead, and when the mind was scattered, the body hesitated, but when awareness remained grounded, movement became immediate and precise. As days turned into weeks, the stillness practice deepened, expanding beyond seated meditation into walking, eating, and even sparring. Jubit was instructed to strike without anger, to defend without urgency, and to move as though time itself had slowed, even when his opponent pressed relentlessly forward. During one sparring session, he noticed that his opponent's aggression no longer triggered panic. Instead, he perceived openings he would have missed before, subtle shifts in weight, slight changes in breath, and moments of imbalance that revealed intent before action. It became clear that this discipline was not about calming the world but about remaining unshaken within it. The master warned him that this state was fragile and easily lost, especially when ego, pride, or fear demanded attention, but with practice, it could become a refuge even in chaos. Jubit began to understand why this method was rarely passed down. It offered no spectacle, no visible achievement, and no immediate validation. Its power was quiet, invisible, and deeply personal, making it unsuitable for those seeking recognition rather than mastery. By the time the master finally allowed Jubit to return fully to the dojo's routines, something fundamental had changed. The weight in his chest had lightened, not because fear had vanished, but because it no longer dictated his actions. In learning to do nothing, Jubit had discovered the discipline required to act decisively when everything was at stake. The first true test of Jubit's transformation arrived without ceremony, announced not by the clash of steel but by the quiet tension that settled over the dojo like a coming storm. A challenger had arrived from the western provinces, a swordsman known for overwhelming his opponents through relentless pressure rather than refined technique. He fought with speed and ferocity, forcing mistakes through sheer intensity, and his reputation alone had unsettled many seasoned warriors. Jubit watched as senior students sparred with the man and faltered one by one, their movements sharp at first but quickly deteriorating as breath shortened and panic crept in. When Jubit was summoned, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest attempt to return, yet this time it was met with awareness rather than resistance. He stepped onto the packed earth, sword in hand, and allowed the noise of the crowd, the heat of the sun, and the challenger's aggressive posture to exist without labeling them as threats. The opening exchange was violent and sudden. The challenger attacked with a barrage of heavy strikes meant to overwhelm and dominate. Jubit's body responded without conscious thought, not retreating in haste but yielding space deliberately, his movements efficient and grounded. He noticed something unexpected. The more aggressively the challenger pressed forward, the clearer Jubit's perception became. Where others had seen chaos, Jubit saw patterns: the slight pause after each powerful swing, the tightening of shoulders before a committed strike, the predictable rhythm hidden beneath the fury. As the duel continued, the challenger grew frustrated, mistaking Jubit's calm for weakness, and began to overextend, pouring even more force into each attack. It was then that Jubit understood the final lesson of the forbidden method: pressure reveals more than it conceals. At the moment when the challenger raised his sword for a decisive blow, Jubit moved, not with speed born of urgency, but with precision born of clarity. One step, one turn of the wrist, and the blade met its mark, halting the attack without spectacle or unnecessary harm. The duel ended not in triumph but in silence, the challenger lowering his weapon in disbelief, as though defeated by something he could not see. Later, as the dojo returned to its routines, the master spoke privately with Jubit, explaining that true mastery under pressure was not the absence of fear, nor the suppression of emotion, but the refusal to let either distort perception. He warned that this state could not be forced and could not be faked. It emerged only through sustained discipline and an honest confrontation with one's own instability. Jubit reflected on how easily he could have lost himself in the crowd's expectations, the challenger's reputation, or his own desire to prove growth, yet none of those impulses had served him. Instead, the discipline of stillness had allowed him to remain untouched by the psychological weight of the moment, even as his body moved decisively within it. The master reminded him that many warriors mistakenly sought invincibility through strength, speed, or aggression, but these qualities failed when pressure reached its peak. What endured was clarity, the ability to see precisely what was happening without embellishment or fear. As night fell and Jubit cleaned his blade, he understood that the duel was not the victory, it was merely confirmation that the method worked. The real challenge lay ahead, in moments when recognition would be absent, when stakes would be higher, and when the temptation to abandon discipline for comfort or pride would be far stronger. Mastery, he realized, was not a destination but a state that demanded constant renewal under pressure. In the weeks following the duel, Jubit's world grew quieter yet more demanding, as though the path itself had narrowed and required greater precision with every step. The master reduced his physical training and instead imposed long hours of stillness, sitting, standing, walking, under conditions designed to unsettle the mind. Jubit was ordered to remain motionless beneath the midday sun until sweat blurred his vision, to sit through winter dawns while cold seeped into his bones, and to walk narrow mountain paths in silence while exhaustion whispered reasons to stop. These trials were not framed as endurance tests, they were lessons in observation. Jubit began to recognize how the mind reacted before the body truly suffered, how discomfort quickly transformed into narrative, and how those narratives, complaints, fears, justifications, were the true enemies of clarity. At times, memories of the duel resurfaced, and with them a subtle pride that attempted to anchor itself in his chest, yet the master warned that pride was simply fear wearing the mask of achievement. One evening, during a prolonged standing meditation, Jubit's legs trembled violently, and his breathing grew shallow as his mind screamed for release. Instead of resisting, he observed the sensation as if it belonged to someone else, noting its rise, its intensity, and eventually its gradual dissolution. In that moment, he experienced a shift more profound than any victory in combat, the realization that no internal state, no matter how overwhelming, was permanent if it was not fed. This understanding deepened as the master began teaching him how pressure corrupts decision-making long before it impairs skill. Through stories of failed warriors and fallen generals, Jubit learned that most defeats occurred not at the blade's edge but in the moments when anticipation replaced awareness. A mind projecting outcomes, victory, humiliation, death, ceased to see what was directly in front of it. Jubit practiced returning again and again to the present, to the weight of his body, the rhythm of breath, the immediate environment, training himself to cut through imagined futures as decisively as he would cut through an opponent's guard. During sparring sessions, the master deliberately provoked him, issuing sudden commands, false openings, and abrupt changes meant to disrupt rhythm and create confusion. Where Jubit once would have reacted impulsively, he now paused, sometimes for only a fraction of a second, allowing clarity to reassert itself before action followed. This pause became his greatest weapon, invisible yet decisive, granting him control not over the opponent, but over himself. The master explained that true dominance did not require constant motion or aggression, it required the ability to wait without tension, to remain poised without expectation. As Jubit absorbed these lessons, he noticed a change beyond the dojo. Everyday challenges, arguments, uncertainty, physical fatigue, lost their sharpness, no longer triggering immediate emotional responses. He began to understand why the forbidden method was rarely taught, it dismantled the illusions that sustained most people's identities. Without the stories of struggle and triumph, there was only action, consequence, and responsibility. This stripping away was not comfortable, and at times Jubit questioned whether the path demanded too much, whether the cost of unbreakable clarity was the loss of warmth and attachment. Sensing this, the master addressed him directly, stating that discipline was not meant to eliminate humanity but to protect it from distortion. A warrior who could not remain clear under pressure would eventually harm himself or others through fear-driven decisions. As the training continued, Jubit realized that the stillness he cultivated was not emptiness but readiness, a calm surface beneath which decisive force could be summoned without hesitation. The pressure had not disappeared, it had become irrelevant. As Jubit's training progressed, the master began to reveal the most dangerous layer of the forbidden discipline, the confrontation with identity itself. Until now, Jubit had been taught to observe pain, fear, and impulse, but this phase demanded something far more unsettling, the dismantling of the self-image he had spent years constructing. The master explained that most warriors were defeated not because they lacked skill, but because they were protecting an idea of who they believed themselves to be. Pride demanded victory, fear demanded survival, and ego demanded recognition, all of which clouded perception at critical moments. Jubit was instructed to train anonymously, to spar without acknowledgement, and to perform difficult tasks without praise or correction. At first, this felt like punishment, as though his efforts vanished into emptiness, but over time he noticed how much of his motivation had been tied to being seen. Without external validation, the mind protested, inventing doubts and resentment, yet the master insisted that this discomfort was proof the training was working. During one exercise, Jubit was ordered to deliberately lose a sparring match against a less experienced student, maintaining full awareness while allowing defeat to occur. The experience was humiliating, and the urge to reclaim dominance burned fiercely, but Jubit observed the sensation instead of reacting. In doing so, he discovered that the fear of appearing weak was far more painful than weakness itself. The master later explained that a warrior enslaved by reputation could never be free under pressure, because the moment reputation was threatened, clarity collapsed. As days turned into months, Jubit practiced releasing attachment to outcome, focusing solely on correct action in each moment. Victory and defeat became irrelevant metrics, replaced by alignment with reality as it unfolded. This shift transformed his presence, his movements grew efficient, his gaze steady, and his decisions immediate yet unforced. The master introduced scenario training designed to break expectation, placing Jubit in unfamiliar environments with incomplete information and conflicting signals. In these moments, Jubit learned to trust direct perception rather than analysis, acting from grounded awareness rather than mental rehearsal. Mistakes were allowed, even encouraged, but hesitation rooted in self-doubt was corrected relentlessly. One night, after a grueling session, Jubit confessed his fear that abandoning identity would leave him empty, stripped of purpose. The master responded that identity was never purpose, it was a cage mistaken for shelter. Purpose emerged naturally when action aligned with necessity, not self-image. This lesson resonated deeply as Jubit began to experience moments of effortless action, where decisions arose without internal debate, and the body responded with precision unburdened by second-guessing. He realized that under pressure, time seemed to slow not because of heightened reflexes, but because the mind no longer fractured into competing narratives. The forbidden method did not make one aggressive or detached, it made one accurate. Jubit's emotions did not vanish, but they lost authority over action, becoming signals rather than commands. The master emphasized that this state could not be forced or imitated, it emerged only through sustained discipline and brutal honesty with oneself. Many who attempted the path abandoned it here, unwilling to relinquish the comfort of identity even at the cost of effectiveness. Jubit understood why the discipline was hidden, it threatened hierarchies, traditions, and illusions of control. A warrior who no longer needed recognition could not be manipulated by praise or fear. As this realization settled, Jubit felt a quiet strength replace ambition, a steadiness that did not seek confrontation yet did not avoid it. The forbidden discipline was no longer a technique he practiced, it was becoming the foundation from which every action emerged. By the time the sixth phase of training began, Jubit no longer measured progress in strength or technique, instead, he sensed refinement in the spaces between action and intention. The master now focused on timing, not speed, but the exact moment when action became inevitable. He explained that most warriors acted either too early, driven by fear, or too late, trapped in analysis, while true mastery existed in a narrow window where movement aligned perfectly with circumstance. Jubit was subjected to exercises that appeared deceptively simple, standing motionless for hours, walking across unstable ground without adjusting pace, and responding to sudden stimuli with only a single allowed movement. Each drill punished excess. A movement too large wasted energy, a movement too small invited failure. Through repetition, Jubit learned to sense the invisible threshold at which action must occur, a sensation that felt less like decision and more like gravity. The master emphasized that this sensitivity could only develop when the mind was quiet enough to register subtle shifts in environment and intention. During sparring, Jubit was forbidden from initiating attacks. He was to wait until the opponent's commitment revealed itself, then respond with decisive finality. At first, this restraint felt unnatural, even passive, but gradually Jubit discovered that patience was not absence of intent, it was compressed power. When the opponent finally moved, Jubit's response was not rushed, it arrived exactly on time, dismantling the attack at its source. The master warned that mistiming by even a fraction could reverse the outcome, turning opportunity into vulnerability. This principle extended beyond combat. Jubit was sent into villages to observe human behavior without interaction, noting patterns of speech, posture, and hesitation. He learned that people, like fighters, telegraphed their intentions long before acting. Fear revealed itself in stillness, aggression in overextension, deception in inconsistency. The discipline taught Jubit to read these signs without judgment, allowing reality to inform response rather than assumption. One evening, the master demonstrated the lesson personally, defeating 3 armed students without visible effort. He did not rush, evade dramatically, or display aggression. He simply stepped into the precise moment where their attacks collapsed under their own weight. Afterward, the master explained that power was not something added, it was something revealed when resistance was removed. Jubit began to understand that mastery was subtraction, not accumulation. Each unnecessary thought, each habitual reaction dulled timing. To sharpen it, the master introduced deprivation training, fasting, sleep reduction, and isolation. These conditions stripped away comfort, exposing raw instinct. Instead of fighting discomfort, Jubit learned to move within it, maintaining precision even when the body protested. This forged trust between mind and body, a silent agreement that action would arise when required. During a night exercise, Jubit was ambushed without warning. He felt fear surge, but instead of suppressing it, he allowed it to pass through awareness without attachment. His response was immediate and exact, neutralizing the threat before conscious thought formed. In that moment, he experienced a clarity so complete that effort disappeared entirely. The master later told him that this was the beginning of true readiness, not constant alertness, but constant availability. Jubit realized that unbreakability was not resistance to pressure, but adaptability within it. Pressure no longer demanded reaction, it provided information. This shift altered his relationship with conflict itself. He no longer sought control over situations, only alignment with their natural flow. The master concluded the phase with a final warning: timing once learned could be lost if ego returned. Mastery required humility, because the moment one believed they controlled the moment, it slipped away. Jubit accepted this truth quietly, understanding that the forbidden discipline was not about domination, but about harmony with inevitability. From this point forward, the path would no longer be guided by instruction alone, it would test whether Jubit could maintain clarity when everything familiar was removed. The 7th phase began without ceremony, instruction, or explanation, which unsettled Jubit more than any physical trial he had endured. The master simply left him alone at the edge of the forest with a single directive: survive without strategy. No plan, no rehearsal, no anticipation. Jubit soon realized this phase was designed to dismantle reliance on preparation itself. The forest became unpredictable, weather shifted without warning, hunger distorted perception, and unfamiliar sounds tested his composure. In earlier training, uncertainty had been an obstacle to overcome, now it was the environment in which mastery would either reveal itself or collapse. Jubit noticed how the mind instinctively searched for patterns to regain control, projecting imagined threats where none existed and missing real ones by overthinking. Each time he attempted to impose order, tension increased and clarity faded. Gradually, exhaustion forced surrender. Without the energy to strategize, Jubit began responding only to what was present. Hunger was not fought, but managed. Fear was not resisted, but observed. When danger appeared, his body moved without hesitation, not because he was ready, but because readiness had become unnecessary. The master later explained that this was the discipline of naked awareness, the state in which nothing stood between perception and action. Jubit learned that most failure did not come from weakness, but from interference, thoughts arriving too early, emotions clinging too long, identity demanding certainty. During a sudden encounter with a rival trainee sent to test him, Jubit felt no surge of aggression or desire to win. His response was precise, restrained, and final, ending the confrontation before it escalated. There was no satisfaction, only resolution. That night, as Jubit sat beneath the open sky, he realized that effortlessness was not laziness, it was alignment. The forbidden discipline stripped away the illusion that control created safety. Instead, safety emerged from responsiveness. The master returned silently at dawn and observed Jubit without speaking. There was nothing to correct. Jubit's posture had changed, his gaze steady but unforced, his movements economical and exact. The master finally spoke, saying that true discipline was not rigid structure, but fluid obedience to reality. Those who cling to routine break when conditions change, those who adapt endure. Jubit understood then why this method was forbidden. It could not be taught to those seeking power, certainty, or identity. It required the willingness to dissolve. The master warned that most who touched this state would abandon it, frightened by the absence of mental scaffolding. But those who remained would become impossible to predict, impossible to pressure, and nearly impossible to defeat. Jubit felt no pride in this revelation, only responsibility. He had crossed into a state where reactions no longer defined him. In its place was a calm readiness that required no effort to maintain. The discipline no longer felt external or enforced, it had become internal, silent, and self-sustaining. Jubit knew that from this moment forward, every encounter would test whether he could remain empty enough to act fully. The path ahead would demand integration, not training. The forest phase had ended, but the real challenge, living without resistance, had only just begun. After the forest, Jubit was returned to the compound, but nothing there felt familiar anymore. The routines that once structured his days now seemed ornamental, almost unnecessary. Where other trainees repeated forms with visible strain, Jubit moved with minimal effort, not faster or stronger, but cleaner. The master observed without interference, allowing the contrast to speak for itself. This phase of training was called integration, though it was never named aloud. Jubit was placed into ordinary situations designed to provoke reaction, public humiliation, contradictory orders, deliberate unfairness, and moments of manufactured chaos. One day he was instructed to guard a gate without explanation, only to be accused hours later of negligence for following the order too literally. Another time he was denied food after completing a task perfectly, while a careless trainee was rewarded openly. These were not tests of endurance or skill, but of attachment. Jubit felt the initial stirrings of frustration rise and pass without grasp. He noticed how emotion attempted to hook into identity, how the mind whispered stories of injustice, ego, and entitlement. But with each observation, the emotion lost momentum, dissolving before it could harden into reaction. The master later explained that most men are not ruled by fear alone, but by the need to protect a self-image. Once that image dissolves, pressure loses its leverage. During sparring, opponents tried to provoke Jubit into aggression, insulting him, breaking rhythm, attacking unpredictably. Instead of resisting, Jubit adjusted, letting force pass through space he no longer occupied. His movements were not defensive or dominant, only responsive. The effect unsettled others. Without visible effort, Jubit ended exchanges quickly, sometimes before observers realized they had begun. The master noted that true calm is disturbing to those who rely on tension to function. As weeks passed, Jubit was sent into villages on minor errands, interacting with civilians who carried their own chaos, anger, desperation, deceit. Where once he might have guarded himself emotionally, he now listened without resistance. He found that people revealed their intentions more clearly when he did not project expectation or fear. In one encounter, a man attempted to provoke violence. Jubit neither escalated nor retreated. He simply remained present, alert, and unmoved. The confrontation dissolved on its own. That night, the master told him that this discipline was never meant only for battle. It was a way of moving through the world untouched by its turbulence. Jubit realized that the greatest threat was not an opponent's blade, but the internal compulsion to react. By removing that compulsion, he had become untouchable in a deeper sense. Praise no longer inflated him. Criticism no longer diminished him. Success and failure passed through without residue. This neutrality was not emptiness, but clarity. Jubit understood that he could now enter any situation, combat, negotiation, chaos, and remain whole. The discipline had not hardened him, it had made him permeable without being penetrated. As the master prepared him for departure, he warned that this state was fragile if taken for granted. It required continuous awareness, not vigilance, but honesty with oneself. Jubit accepted this without ceremony. He did not feel complete, only aligned. The world ahead would test whether this clarity could survive real consequence, where outcomes mattered and mistakes could not be corrected. The training grounds had shaped him, but life would decide whether the discipline truly lived within him. Jubit left the compound at dawn without ceremony, carrying nothing except what the discipline had carved into him. The world beyond the gates moved louder, faster, and more chaotically than the controlled space he had known, yet he felt no need to brace himself against it. His first true test came not in battle, but in uncertainty. Rumors of unrest spread across the provinces, alliances shifted without warning, and men trained for violence found themselves waiting endlessly for commands that never came. In this waiting, Jubit observed something the master had once warned him about: idle fear is more dangerous than immediate danger. Among soldiers, anxiety fermented into recklessness, while others collapsed into passivity, imagining outcomes they could not control. Jubit remained present. When orders finally arrived, they were incomplete, contradictory, and delivered too late. The unit was sent to secure a narrow mountain pass already occupied by unknown forces. As night fell, confusion rippled through the ranks. Some sharpened blades obsessively. Others prayed. Jubit simply prepared his equipment and sat, breathing evenly, aware of sound, terrain, and his own internal state. When contact came, it was sudden and disorganized. Shadows collided in the dark, commands were shouted and lost, and fear surged like a wave through men who had never learned how to carry it. Jubit moved without urgency. He did not rush toward danger or flee from it. Each action emerged from awareness rather than impulse. When attacked, he responded decisively, not with aggression, but with precision. His mind did not narrow. It expanded. He perceived openings not because he searched for them, but because nothing inside him was screaming for safety. Others later described it as if Jubit was always a step ahead of events, not predicting them, but meeting them exactly as they occurred. The engagement ended quickly, not because it was easy, but because confusion could not take hold around him. In the aftermath, Jubit tended to the wounded without attachment to outcome or recognition. Victory did not excite him. Survival did not relieve him. Both were simply results. Later, as dawn revealed the cost of the encounter, Jubit noticed something profound. He remembered every moment with clarity, while others recalled only fragments blurred by panic. Fear had hijacked their perception, stealing memory itself. Jubit understood then that the discipline did more than guide action, it preserved consciousness under pressure. In the days that followed, his presence began to influence others. Men stood straighter around him. Panic diminished in his proximity. Not because he commanded authority, but because his steadiness created an anchor. Leaders noticed this and placed him where morale collapsed most easily. Again and again, Jubit was sent into unstable situations, and again, they stabilized. The discipline was no longer something he practiced. It was something others felt. One evening, as he sat alone overlooking a valley marked by the scars of conflict, Jubit realized that fear had not vanished from his life. It arose as naturally as ever. The difference was that it no longer decided his behavior. He saw fear as weather passing through the body, not a command to obey. In that moment, he understood the final lesson: courage is not a surge of strength in crisis, but the quiet refusal to abandon awareness when everything urges you to. This was what made a warrior unshakable, not dominance, not rage, not fearlessness, but the ability to remain present when presence mattered most. Years later, long after the battles that once defined him had faded into stories told by others, Jubit walked alone along a quiet road at dawn, indistinguishable from any ordinary traveler. There were no banners, no armor, no visible proof of what he had endured or mastered. And that was the final expression of the discipline. The method was never meant to create legends who demanded recognition, but men who could stand firm without needing to be seen. Jubit had faced fear in its most extreme forms, yet what mattered most were not the battles he survived, but the countless moments where he chose awareness over avoidance. The discipline had not erased his fear, nor had it turned him into something unnatural. It had simply removed fear's authority. This was the same battle faced by people centuries later, in offices instead of battlefields, before conversations instead of combat, under pressure that threatened identity rather than life. The mind still reacts the same way. The body still floods with signals urging escape. The difference between those who retreat and those who move forward has never been courage as a personality trait. It has always been training. Jubit's legacy was not his technique with a blade, but the invisible structure he built within himself, one repetition at a time. Each moment he stayed present under discomfort strengthened that structure until it became unshakable. This was the secret the discipline guarded so fiercely: you do not rise to the level of your intentions in moments of pressure, you fall to the level of your training. When fear appears, you will not suddenly become brave. You will become what you have practiced being. Jubit understood that mastery was not a destination, but a commitment renewed daily. Some mornings he still woke with unease. Some days doubt crept in. But these sensations no longer dictated his path. They were acknowledged and allowed to pass, while action continued. In this way, the discipline transcended time. It belonged as much to the modern individual standing on the edge of a difficult decision as it did to the warrior standing before an uncertain battle. The path was never dramatic. It was quiet, repetitive, and often uncomfortable. And that was precisely why it worked. Fear thrives in chaos and avoidance. It weakens when met with calm repetition and deliberate presence. Jubit's life became proof that unshakable courage is not found by seeking confidence, motivation, or reassurance. It is forged by choosing to remain conscious when the mind demands escape. The discipline did not promise an easy life. It promised a real one. A life where fear could exist without control, where pressure did not erase clarity, and where action was guided by purpose rather than impulse. This is the ancient method that survives not because it is mystical, but because it is honest. It accepts fear as permanent and trains behavior anyway. And for anyone willing to practice it, the result is the same now as it was then, not the absence of fear, but the presence of a mind that refuses to be moved by it.